Picture the scene today. In Moscow, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are ushered into the Kremlin for yet another long audience with Vladimir Putin. In Dublin, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is being cheered to the rafters in the parliament, talking about justice, memory, and hatred that will not fade. And cutting across both is Putin's threat that if Europe wants a war, we're ready right now. This is the backdrop for the 20-point peace plan, and we need to see what's actually happening and why Putin's talk of war is not a sideshow but part of the bargaining. The first draft, the notorious 28-point plan put together by Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, was immediately attacked in Kyiv and European capitals. It read like a Russian wish list. Ukrainian troop ceilings, an effective ban on NATO membership, sweeping territorial concessions in Donbass and beyond, and generous treatment of Russian frozen assets that looked suspiciously like a business opportunity for Washington. Now, of course, the Russian war effort is intolerable and ever advancing in a sort of minute way, because Russia has a huge number of people that it can throw into the meat grinder. Ukraine has far less people and is far less willing to sacrifice individuals simply to move an inch forward in a year. Putin doesn't have that constraint or that moral concern. Zelenskyy confirmed today in Dublin that he's now cut down the 28-point plan and reworked it into a 20-point framework agreed between Kyiv and Washington. The crucial differences are the most toxic provisions have been stripped out or left blank: no explicit cap on the Ukrainian army, no written veto on NATO membership, no automatic territorial surrender written into the document. The hardest issues are now parked: territory, frozen Russian assets, long-term security guarantees. Those questions will be reserved for direct negotiations between Zelenskyy and Trump, and if the process makes it that far, then there may be some progress. That is the danger. Progress, because Kyiv is no longer being asked to sign its own strategic amputation up front. Danger, because the really existential questions are precisely the ones not yet written down. Zelenskyy called this one of the most challenging and yet optimistic moments, and stressed that Ukraine is closer to peace than at any time since the invasion, but only if peace is dignified and genuinely ends the war, not just pauses it. So who's actually in the room now? The cast matters. On the Russian side, you have Vladimir Putin, fresh from the Smeg fridge, Yuri Yushakov, his veteran policy advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, who's been central to quiet back-channel contacts with the US for years. On the American side, Steve Witkoff, the property developer turned special envoy, whose earlier 28-point draft was written in such Russian-friendly language that some analysts thought parts of it had been translated straight out of a Russian original. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, with well-documented business links in the Gulf and a history of blurring private deals and public diplomacy. Notably absent from Moscow is Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who had tried to toughen the text in Geneva, and notably irritated are the Europeans who have supplied much of the money and weapons, but not much, but now watch the talks from the corridor. So the architecture of this is clear. Two businessmen close to Trump sit opposite Putin and his economic envoy, with the formal diplomats and the Europeans shoved to one side. That's not a neutral environment. It tilts the conversation towards a transactional bargain rather than a principled settlement. Just before seeing Witkoff, Putin went on stage at a Moscow investment forum and delivered the line that will echo in every European capital tonight and be on the front page of all the newspapers. We are not planning to go to war with Europe, but if Europe wants to and starts, we are ready right now. He coupled this with an attack on European unacceptable demands, especially any peace terms that protect Ukraine's path to NATO or insist on full accountability for war crimes. A threat to hit Ukrainian ports and treat all shipping to those ports as potential targets in retaliation for Ukrainian strikes on Russian shadow fleet boats in the Black Sea. The logic is straightforward. Putin wants to paint Europe as the party of war, Trump as the man of peace, to drive a wedge between Washington and European capitals, who have proposed their own revisions to the plan, insisting on Ukrainian territorial integrity, NATO freedom of choice, and strict war crimes accountability. And to raise the cost of delay by threatening escalation at sea and hinting at wider confrontation. Meanwhile, NATO generals are noisily debating preemptive action against Russian hybrid attacks, cyber strikes, cable sabotage, drone incursions, a discussion Moscow is already presenting as evidence of Western aggression. So, we now have a dangerous spiral of rhetoric on both sides, right at the moment when the negotiating table finally looks busy. While all this goes on in Moscow, Zelensky's appearance in Dublin has three purposes. First, to signal that Ukraine is fully engaged in the peace process and not the obstacle. He talks about being closer to peace than ever before and stresses that Kyiv is working through all 20 points with its partners. Second, to nail down European political cover and money. Ireland announces a fresh package of around 100 million euros in non-lethal aid, taking its total this year to roughly 200 million euros. Dublin gives loud support for Ukraine's EU accession and for the use of frozen Russian assets for reconstruction. And third, to draw a moral line. In the Irish Parliament, Zelensky warns without a just peace, hatred will not fade. Europe must not drift back to business as usual with Russia or fall into amnesia about war crimes. Yet he also admits he's afraid that the US could lose interest, and that is precisely Moscow's goal. So his message is double-edged. Yes, there is movement, and yes, the US is still leaning in, but time and patience are finite, and if allies tire, Putin's maximalist wins will be the winning position by default. The strategic equation behind the table is well, Russia is threatening Europe and blocking the Black Sea, not from a position of overwhelming strength, but from inside a war economy that independent analysts now suggest is far weaker than official statistics claim. There is growing evidence of hidden inflation, an exhausted sovereign wealth fund, and sharply falling real incomes for most Russians despite windfalls for the military-industrial class. Ukraine, however, is under even more acute strain, a large budget deficit, manpower problems, and scandals around parts of its domestic elite. It cannot fight indefinitely without secure long-term guarantees from the US and the EU that simply do not exist in treaty form. Europe is simultaneously talking about just peace and accountability, failing to agree on full energy sanctions or a large-scale reparations loan based on frozen Russian assets, flirting with more aggressive NATO options in response to hybrid attacks while not actually matching Russia's scale of mobilized industry and manpower. Into that gap steps Donald Trump, keen to present himself as the deal maker who solved Gaza and will now end the war in Ukraine. Witkoff and Kushner embody that approach, personalized, transactional, impatient with legal detail or collective security architecture. If you go down to the essentials, the next questions determine whether this 20-point plan becomes the basis of a real peace or a prelude to the next disaster. First, is there consent and dignity for Ukraine? Zelensky is being clear. The task is to end the war, not to enshrine a pause that lets Russia rearm. Any deal that is perceived in Ukraine as an externally imposed diktat, a Yalta Mark II brokered over its head, will not be stable, whatever signatures are on the paper. Secondly, is the security architecture in place? Parking the big questions and leaving them blank is tactically useful, but it cannot be the end state. A credible settlement needs clear guarantees that Russia will not simply attack again in 5 years' time, real constraints on Russian rearmament, not just on Ukraine, a defined role for NATO and the EU hub providing the deterrent and the money. If instead the final bargain is just some territory for some sanctions relief, some nice words about non-aggression, then we will have reinvented the Minsk trap on a larger scale. And the final bargain needs to be clear and needs to be just. If not, it's Minsk Part 3. The third question is there justice and is memory properly addressed? Zelensky's line in Dublin about hatred not fading is doing heavy lifting. If war crimes, deported children, mass graves, and the deliberate targeting of civilians is quietly swept under the diplomatic carpet, the settlement will be morally corrupt and politically brittle. Accountability can be squeezed, sequenced, and staged, but it cannot simply be traded away. So as Witkoff sits in the Kremlin, flanked by Kushner on one side and Dmitriev on the other, the 20-point plan sits in the middle like a Rorschach test. Putin sees an opportunity to bank his gains, fracture Western unity, and present any compromise as a Russian victory, backed by threats of war with Europe if he's crossed. Trump sees a chance to claim the Nobel Prize he keeps half joking about and to reduce US financial exposure. Zelenskyy sees perhaps the last window to secure a just peace before exhaustion sets in among his allies, and Europeans see themselves squeezed between their rhetoric about justice and their reluctance to pay the full price of deterrence. A real settlement is still possible, but it will require leaders to resist not only Putin's threats, but also the temptation of a shabby compromise dressed up as a peace. The litmus test is simple. Will this deal make another Russian assault on Ukraine harder or easier in 5 years' time? If the answer is easier, then today's peace plan is not the end of a war, it is only an interval.